Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor Jeroen Duindam. All right, Professor Jeroen. So I am Lipton, and today we're going to be discussing your work on dynasties. So Jeroen, so recently you penned a paper titled Gender, Succession, and Dynastic Rule. And I really like this paper for several reasons. It compares primogeniture to other systems of succession. It gives us an outline of the history of kinship and matriarchy. And also, you debunk the notion that African leaders were despotic. So I remember the title, sorry, not the title, I remember the statement by John Beatty. So,
Yeah,
Jeroen, before we delve into this article, you're going to tell us a little about your work on dynasties. What is a dynasty?
well, a dynasty is basically a family in power, but we usually associate it with families on royal thrones, so ruling families, and it's actually a far more general phenomenon. Almost all societies in history, apart from those societies where the levels of sort of social differentiation really are minimal, have families that aspire to leading positions. And you could say dynasty is really an almost general phenomenon in history taken if you accept these societies there where really only gender and age groups are the basic formatting. So although we tend to think of dynasty as royal dynasties, as lineages of power where families hold at least for 3 or more generations, they are on the throne, it is a far more general aspect of human society throughout history, I would say.
Jeroen, would you say that dynasties offer a superior form of leadership? Are dynasties more effective, less effective, or just corrupt?
That is, of course, an intriguing question. I certainly do not think that dynasties are more effective than, let's say, other currently more common forms of government. But I do think you get them in all types. You get really incredibly violent, inefficient, and in almost all respects, negative examples of dynastic power. But we do have the tendency in our modern world to contrast pre-modern forms of power with our own world in a sense of self-confirmation of our own achievements. And I do think we tend to overstate and view the pre-modern world as necessarily violent and bad in many respects, and at times overstate the order and the level of, well, let's use this awkward term, civilization of our own world. And it is necessary for me as an historian, and also as an anthropologist, to try and not look at the ideological cleavage between modern democratic society and the dynastic world, but to be more concrete and look at power structures, look at patterns of behavior that allow us to see some fundamental changes, but also some remarkable continuities. And also, I would say, dynastic power is still very much present in our own world. And you could see it even as a certain, well, I'm hesitant to speak about laws of development, but as soon as a person acquires power concentrated in his or sometimes her own hands, there will be a tendency towards heredity, towards appointing family members, to nepotism, to appointing your own clique, and to other aspects that we know very well from history. And this is not necessarily only the case in let's say autocratic states. It is also the case, for instance, in the modern US, you will find political families all over the world. There are families where a level of continuity and of semi-heredity in power is common. And very often too, another question that really profoundly interests me in my work is, as you mentioned in your introduction, Lipton, is the place of women, the relation of women to power holding. And there you see, for instance, that we're frequently discussing the glass ceiling of women in power holding, that very often, as in the past, women with a certain dynastic position in the sense of being daughters or widows of famous leaders, far more often do get positions of power than women who do not have these family relationships. And the difference is the same phenomenon can be seen in the case of men, but it's far more outspoken in the case of women.
How do women usually rise to power?
In dynastic history, it's a very simple story. They rise to power almost only in case where male contenders for power have killed each other. So where there's no male candidate for the throne, and then women, in fact, their blood, their dynastic blood, and their pedigree defines them as the only available candidate. But they usually are then sort of intermediate candidates, and they very often come to the throne also as mothers of young possible successors of princes who will then become king. So the general rule basically is they come to the throne because succession strife removed male contenders. They are no longer there. And then they can arise as sovereign queens, but they quite more often come to power as mothers and regents. And that we can see also in areas where they are even not formally allowed to rule. They can be accepted as ruling temporarily in the place of a minor ward of a boy who still is has not reached the age of formal the possibility to rule. So these are the two main ways, either through the absence of male candidates, and then they can really become sovereign queens, or as the regents and mothers of young princes who will then become king after them. The one point that is interesting here is that once we do find a woman in power, we see these phases where women succeed other women. So in a sense, you can say that some women in the past were able, because of these specific situations, to break through the limitations that were usually present for them. Then the possibility for other women to succeed tends to increase.
Professor, comment on the story of Queen Ninjinga. Yes. Tell us about her.
She is interesting in several ways. She's interesting because she rises to power because of the death of a brother on the throne, and she's responsible as a ward for his son. And this is an active woman with a clear view of her ambitions. Then the boy, she gets rid of the boy, she rules in her own name. She becomes a true leader, also a military leader, and she cultivates this leadership role. She starts out having a harem of women, and then she redefines herself, or she has. I'm mixing up things. She has a group of male concubines, as it were, and then she redefines herself as a man and has a harem of women. So it is, and she fights on an almost permanent basis with her status as a woman who rose to power. She needs to somehow, even in an area, and this is a point I think that we will return to soon, in an area where matrilineal succession through the female line was accepted, the power of women in full sovereign capacity was not necessarily accepted. And she struggled for her lifetime with this different role, trying different options, as it were. Whereas after her death, we see in Dongo Matamba, the region where she ruled, we see a series of queens. So she is a good example of a woman who fights her way to the throne in a violent way, who redefines her position permanently, who struggles with the fact that power is very often gendered in male terms, and in the end chooses, as it were, to reform herself to be a male, and then nevertheless opens up a phase where several women rise to power as queens in her region.
Yeah, so she had female concubines and also male lovers like the South African Lovido Rain Queens.
Yeah, that's another that's the one example actually that I could locate in my search for not only women as sovereign queens, but of course there are really relatively frequent examples of women as sovereign queens. There were, but of women as sovereign queens who were seen as the rule rather than the exception, and who succeeded each other. So we have a series of 6 reign queens in Lobedu in South Africa in succession from 1800 to actually to 2000. And these were women who succeeded each other, but they were sort of in a very special status. They were hidden in a sense. They were seen as sort of, they were not seen as women, and had a series of also had a harem. So harems are important, polygyny is important. And we very often picture this in sexual terms, but it is important and actually vital for many modern, sort of pre-modern societies and states, as a system of exchange, of connecting people, integrating people through marriage alliances, moving out from the harem and from giving women to the harem. This is just, it's far more than some sort of a sexual playing ground for a ruler. This is a place where groups are tied to the center. But in case of the reign queens, it was sort of a formal secret. She could not have a male partner. She could only formally have the harem women that through which the coherence of the realm was organized. And so her own procreation and succession were basically secret. But this is really an exceptional case where women were succeeding each other in a complicated story of how their femininity was hidden, as it were. And it's the one example of a continuing succession from woman to woman. We have other examples, for instance, in Madagascar, or in several parts of Africa, or in several parts also of Southeast Asia. Actually, these are the 2 regions where you see this most often. But it remains quite exceptional, and it never was quite the rule. And there is always a tendency to revert to the default situation where men are seen as the epitome of rulership. And this is an intriguing exception, but it is important to keep in mind that the rule throughout history tends to be that men are the ones who are seen as the rulers, the people on the throne. Women in practice are always present, always important in a variety of key roles, and often their presence and their impact and their power was underplayed by chroniclers who basically focused on the male part of the story and left out the female part of the story, or sometimes did not leave it out, but presented it in terms of meddling, illegitimacy. So they blackened women in power. But it is important to keep in mind that as far as I can see, there really never was a phase of what you could call matriarchy, a clear presence, a clear preference for women in power.
Please tell us about co-leaders. So in your paper, you argue that men had co-leaders, and these co-leaders were not their mothers.
Mm-hmm. There is great differentiation here. I assume you're talking about women who act as co-leaders, who
Yes.
act as, yeah.
Like the Inca, you say the Inca queens were either the king's sisters
Well,
or hailed from noble lineages.
Yeah, very often, the thing that is important to keep in mind is, even though you can say men on the throne are the rule in history, there always are women in different capacities. And we see regionally that these capacities differ enormously. So I've discussed in the absence of male candidates that women can rise to sovereign power. I've discussed mothers as regents, so that we see throughout the world, I think. But we have, particularly in Africa, I would say, the example of queen mothers who are not necessarily the mothers of the ruling prince. In Europe, a queen mother is something, and this would be the same story, let's say, in the Ottoman empires, empire with the Valide Sultan, or in China with dowager empresses. A queen mother is a person who rules during the minority of a king, so only temporarily. In Africa, we find queen mothers whom you could also label reign mates. So they are sort of women ruling in their own right next to a king, totally separate from the question whether of age. So even with a fully mature king, there will still be a female reign mate, and there are, as it were, separate worlds of men and women, and the queen, the reign mate, the queen mother, can act as a ruler for. Sometimes she's seen as the ruler for the women in a way, or sometimes as representing other groups and other interests than the male sovereign king. So we have a variety of capacities. The reign mate is one, who is not necessarily a mother, who can be from the same generation, and they are very often key persons in succession. So a king will be important in the succession of the queen mother or reign mate, and vice versa. The queen mother or reign mate will be a key person in defining royal succession. And then in addition to this twofold division of power, and you mentioned the Inca situation where you see not quite similar things, but where the female lineage was really important too, and that you see in many places also in Europe. But another aspect in Africa is that you can at times also see a third person, that a sister can be of special importance. And at the background of this whole story is the question of, and perhaps this is a point where you want to hear more about this, is the question of matrilineal and patrilineal. Our view, you asked me to define dynasty at the start of our conversation. Our view of dynasty tends to be formatted almost entirely by a patrilineal perspective. That is, the standard view of dynastic succession is father-son succession, and in that case, a ruling king who holds royal blood will father a successor. Of course, queens can be important; their blood, their lineage can be important, but it's the father's blood that determines succession. And so there's a combination of fatherhood and also of direct father-son succession. Of they share the same family name, as it were. In matrilineal settings, the whole setup totally changes, because in the key aspect of matrilineal succession is that fathers' sons, king's sons, can no longer succeed, only in case of full royal incest. So where a king, for instance, has a sister as partner, as mate, then they are both of royal blood. Then, of course, the ideal successor, and we find this very often in stories and sometimes in practice, the ideal successor is then the son of this king, this couple, because they are both of royal blood. Far more common in matrilineal is succession of others born from the same female line. So most often sisters' sons. So you move sideways in the same generation. It's not your son, but it's your sister's son. Or at times, brothers born from the same mother. That's another option. So you stay in the same generation. But the key thing is you don't move downwards vertically, you move sideways horizontally. And this has an immense impact, not only on the relationship between kings and their sons. This is very often a difficult relationship, because succession, one of the many key sort of rules of thumb in the history of dynastic power is that succession rights create tensions, particularly between ruling kings and their brothers, but also between kings and their sons, particularly during long reigns. So if your son cannot succeed, these tensions are taken away. And you can have sort of a friendly alliance with your son rather than a sense of rivalry. On the other hand, and this is the key aspect, I think, the movement sideways to sister sons, most often, that's the key process here, means in most of the cases, in moving succession rights, the eligibles to succession to all descendants of females in the royal of the royal lineage means that you have several candidates, and very often means that this lateral sideways form of succession entails some sort of competition for the throne, some sort of king-making practice. It can be violent, as it very often is in the patrilineal situation, but it can also move through a series of rituals that are not necessarily violent and a series of election-like procedures. So actually the funny thing about matrilineal succession to power is that the first observers of this practice, most of all in Africa, among the Ashanti and other people.
Yes, tell us about the Asante.
They compared it to early Greek democracy. They said this is and I think this was sort of overstating the case, and it's overstating, using the term democracy for Greece in many ways. Ancient Greece is just a complicated perspective, but in any case, they saw a society where at all levels of the Ashanti Federation, basically there was a sort of bottom-up procedure where kings could also be destooled. So if they did not conform to the expectations, if they misbehaved, they could be destooled. And we have the same pattern here of not only a sovereign king present, but also a semi-sovereign, you could say, queen present. And this Ashanti example is reflected in many other places in Africa, in West Africa, but also in sort of a belt moving from East Africa to South, from West Africa to Southeast Africa, the Bantu migration belt, where matrilineal is more common than in other places of the world, but also, and this makes it, I think, more widespread as a phenomenon in dynastic power holding, where patrilineal societies still have very similar rules about, for instance, succession, where also places where succession basically is through the male line, the key aspect of matrilineal power, the prohibition against king's sons succeeding, is maintained. And so where the key aspect of some sort of a diffusion and circulation of kingship is maintained, where the ambition is not necessarily concentrating kingship in the hands of one small nuclear family through time, concentrating over time prestige and wealth into the hands of this small group, but where a diffusion of wealth and of prestige and of power holding is seen as of the essence. And so that key aspect of matrilineal power can be found in many patrilineal groups throughout Africa.
Kings, Professor Jeroen, were kings limited by rituals? In your article, you discuss the sacred nature of kingship and how this was employed to restrict political power.
Yeah, the key thing about kingship is that it comes as soon, the higher you elevate kings, the higher you push them, as it were, to the sphere of divinity, of sacrality, of the heavens, of some sort of a semi-supernatural meta-person status, the more you tend to restrict them. So what I find interesting, and this is, I think, typically for the type of comparison that I think really should be practiced more often in history, is what struck me in looking at the question you're asking me now in a global perspective. The two examples that strike the eye of kings that have or you should say rulers, kings, emperors, because the names, of course, for these positions can differ culturally throughout the globe. But the Chinese emperor, who holds the mandate of heaven, who was responsible for cosmic harmonies, who was responsible for harvests, who was responsible for droughts, is an unapproachable figure on the whole. And his key role is not necessarily leading armies, some emperors have done so, and not necessarily acting as his own first minister, although, again, some emperors will do this, but is performing the correct rituals, is monitoring his own morality, is ruling through virtue, as it were. Now, of course, this is an ideal, it's not necessarily practice, but you see a distancing of this figure, and you see also all sorts of limitations, and this varies per dynasty, because conquest dynasties with a steppe background or a nomadic background tend to be far more active and mobile than Chinese dynasties. But there is this overall aspect of the Chinese imperial dignity as withdrawn, as to some extent invisible, as focused on ritual propriety and the grand sacrifices, the great moments of ritual performance, and on self-improvement more than on actual political activity. Now, if you look around the world, where do you find an example that comes closest to this? I think this is Africa. And then where we have ritual kingship, sacralized kingship, divinized kingship in many places, and where we see, for instance, kings they are prohibited to touch the floor, so they can only touch animal skins, and very often lion skins or so animals with a certain reputation. They cannot be looked in the eye, so they wear, for instance, these beaded veil crowns. You cannot speak to them directly. You need to speak through an intermediary. They are unapproachable in other respects, and they are seen as responsible for the connection between the living and the dead, between heaven and earth. They are responsible for fertility, for harmony, for harvests, for all these things. And this is the same with the mandate of heaven in China, or the same, comparable, I should perhaps say. As soon as these harmonies are threatened, as soon as things happen that should not happen, this also makes it possible to accuse a king, to say, well, you are no longer performing the role you have. Either there has been impurity in your life, or perhaps you've been unjust, or you've done other things. And so it also is an indirect way to say you can no longer serve in this capacity. Now, this immobilized form of ritual kingship really makes these kings far less able to actively rule their peoples. They usually have others to step in. Let's say grand secretaries, people who organize government, or stand-ins, proxies who do the actual work. And it is a way, you can say it is, I don't think it is a conscious way to, as it were, disempower kings, but it shows us, and this is a really a key sense, a key insight, I think. It shows us that you should never take stories about absolute power, about total sort of divine sacralized power, as reflecting a practical power. These are images. These are images that in practice can freeze people into immobility. And the extreme cases of China and African ritual kingship they tell us something about comparison, because we tend to compare not on the basis of what I've done, this pre-modern general aspect of dynastic power. We tend to compare on the basis of criteria that are related mostly to modernity, to modernization. So we think about forms of government, social differentiation, economic productivity, and these things. And as soon as and therefore, comparative history very often also is a history of why did Europe rise to power? Why didn't China rise to power? And for instance, Africa tends to be totally invisible in this type of comparative history, and other places of the world too. As soon as you start out with typically pre-modern constellations such as dynastic power, which you find all over the world in places of very different types of social organization, you see different parallels, you see different contrasts. And here the sort of the extreme case of a large-scale, highly, well, bureaucratized, maybe an overstatement, but highly an empire based on script culture, that is surely not an overstatement, of an immense scale. In this respect, comes close to small-scale societies in different parts of Africa, where there's no script, or at least in most places, little or no relevance of script, and where we find exactly the same, or in very many respects, a similar formatting of inaccessibility of kingship. Now, moving your question about ritualized power and sort of as an instrument to make kings less powerful to other places, I think you always need to separate between the position of kingship and the person holding power. And you always need to ask the question, is the person who reigns also the person who rules? And very often in history, you will find that the person who is formally holding power and sitting on the throne is intimidated by this task. And this intimidation can go in several directions. You can become violent and irresponsible, because you don't know how to somehow carry these immense responsibilities, or you can withdraw among a group of trusted confidence and leave matters to others. Very often you will find that kings do take this sort of religiously colored responsibility seriously, and it can lead to awkward violence and misbehavior. Very often they do take it seriously, and very often it leaves them almost baffled about their own position and leaves them actually powerless, or they leave the business of political trafficking and of ruling to others, and they shield behind these others. So the whole aspect of favorites, of éminence grise, people behind the throne, is really strongly present in the history of dynastic power. I hope this more or less answers your question, Lipton.
Yes. So your article, well, some people would say that it's a long article. I think that it's relatively short. I read articles like this all the time. But under less than 1 hour, we have managed to cover the important aspects of the piece. But now we're going to talk about two aspects of the piece that are quite crucial. One, are patriarchies more effective for political consolidation? That's the first question.
Yeah. Shall we go into the first one now?
And the second question is this. Do matriarchies reduce political violence? Because you're referring to a novel argument that was made by an earlier academic who gives credence to the role of matriarchies in civilizing society.
Yeah, these are two key points, I think. And I would want to start out first with sort of a matter of terminology. I'm not using the terms patriarchy and matriarchy, but I'm actually concentrating on formats of succession and inheritance. And so I'm concentrating on patrilineal and matrilineal, because matriarchy is simply not so much present in the historical record, whereas matrilineal, or forms of kinship that are based on the female line, is very much present. And so I think that's a first distinction that's really important to make, because it is a distinction that is really clouding the conversation on this topic, because there has been sort of a long discussion on matriarchy. It was there's a very famous 19th century book by Bachofen, and it's called Mutterrecht. Mutterrecht basically means mother's right, and it basically also means transmission of family and power through the female line, not necessarily power. I'm saying this in the wrong way. The family line goes through women, basically because the argument used to be paternity uncertainty. You never know who the father is. You think you know, you will very often know, but you're by definition sure who the mother will be. So there's maternity certainty and paternity uncertainty. Now, Bachofen also made the point about what he called gynecocratie, that is matriarchy, the power in the hands of women. And he sort of postulated an early phase where women held power. And this idea has been totally discredited, the idea of an early phase of female power, as an overstatement of the fact that perhaps kinship was defined through the female line in an earlier period. And it is important because my article wants to open up the discussion again, not to start out with matriarchy and patriarchy, but to start out with family lines, with patrilineal and matrilineal. But sorry about this sort of introduction, Lipton. I'm now moving to your two important questions. I do think it is undisputable that patrilineal, so succession through the male line, is so connected to property and political consolidation. And I have no examples of major land-based empires in world history that were long-lasting and that practiced matrilineal succession through the female line. And actually, there is this clear aspect of and the examples in anthropological work from the 60s and 70s that has been sort of cast aside by later generations of anthropologists because they rightly assume that kinship is not the only thing defining societies. There are many other things. But in this early work in the 1960s and 1970s, many people have developed ideas about, for instance, herds drive out matrilineal. If as soon as you assemble herds, as soon as you are domesticating animals on a large scale, and as soon as you move from horticulture, so hakbouw is another term that's used for this, and you use the plow, and you start cultivating fields more distant from your bases, then patrilineal will arise, because then fatherhood is and males, you have to remind yourself, also in matrilineal situations, male positions are usually they are the ones who hold power, or we're closer to power holding, and moving to property, to herds, to fields, and to political prestige. You see that succession is concentrated in male hands, and that is something that you very often can see. You see that this ecological change, as it were, leads also to a change in succession patterns and location patterns, where males become dominant. So from matrilineal to patrilineal. And the fact that it's difficult to find any example of long-lasting, large-scale, concentrated political empires or empires throughout history where matrilineal was practiced. We have some very minor early examples where to some extent this may have been the case, does tell you that there is an element where increased property, increased sort of the necessity, the relevance of concentrating this property and making sure it lands to your next of kin in the next generation, that this stimulates the changeover from matrilineal to patrilineal. Having said this, there's another argument developed, I think, with great power by among others, Mary Douglas, so the famous anthropologist, that in situations of relative abundance and in situations where not so much property or concentration of property is the issue, but where you want to attract people into your group because you have an abundance in terms of lands, fisheries, or because you're mobile, you're moving to other places, and you want to increase the extent of your alliances, as it were, then matrilineal, as the more open format, as the more sort of flexible format, is really, it can be far more successful, but it tends to be concentrated in moments of migration and in specific ecological settings. So in fisheries or horticulture, where there can be, of course, there not always is, but where there can be relative abundance and where labor can be scarce, there in these settings, matrilineal will survive and will be the more successful format. Now, moving to your second question about matrilineal and its relationship to violence. So that is an intriguing one and a difficult one. First of all, we've seen the tendency in matrilineal succession of sideways and lateral succession. So there is some sort of, let's say, inclusivity, integration, more open aspect of power holding and property management that you can see as related to matrilineal. Also, it is clear that throughout history, the presence of agnates, of male relatives together, and the concentration of male relatives within their own village or so. So in situations where the patrilineal, the male line, defines where you live and how you live, tends to create sort of inter-village raiding. So one village moves to another, and then women raiding is a common a way to somehow organize the continuity of your settlement. So close by, raiding tends to be connected to the presence of these male interest groups. Now, in a matrilineal setting, males will very often also be metrofocal, move to other villages. So they need to move back and forth between villages, among villages. They have all sorts of obligations in different villages, and they do not live among their male a group of origin. They live in another group. And this sort of breaks apart these fraternal, these agnate groups that are the source of violence in patrilineal settings, or one of the sources of violence. Conversely, you have to say, and this is related to the migration aspect, that matrilineal, in its ability to organize alliances and its ability to bring together many people, tends to be associated not only with waves of migration, and here's the Bantu migration in Africa, but there's also the Austronesian migration in the Southeast Asian, Australian, and ocean region, as it were. But it's also related, and it goes together with migration, to large-scale distant warfare. And you can see the connection in another way too. If males are absent on large-scale, long-lasting warfare, which is another frequently occurring situation, then matrifocal, female bias concentrated on women forms of kinship tend to emerge more often. Because in the absence of males, or in the mobility distance, the frequent mobility of males, then fatherhood becomes less important and motherhood becomes more important. So there is a series of connections, and I think it's really important to not necessarily contrast these connections with conclusions such as, well, then men are more often sort of related to violence, prestige, property, and women are more often related to sort of openness, integration, diffusion, circulation, and peacefulness. I don't think that is necessarily the case, because men and women, I mean, this is a scale, of course there are differences, but this is a sort of an extreme black and white typology. It's far more differentiated. But on the other hand, there are social settings and ecological situations where violence is stimulated, or different formats of violence can take shape. And that is, I think, a more profound conclusion than really concentrating on the male-female difference.
Yes. So excellent conversation. But before we go, this question should have been posed earlier. Primogeniture.
Yeah.
Is it an effective system of inheritance?
Primogeniture is effective in one way. It concentrates power. It is, as it were, primogeniture is not impossible within matrilineal forms, but we often associate it with patrilineal succession, with father-son succession. So within patrilineal, you can move sideways to your brothers, you can move downwards to your sons, and downwards to your sons will concentrate power more and wealth more effectively than sideways to your brothers, where there's more competition. And reducing the right of succession and the right of, and also the larger part, which we see in many elites worldwide, the larger, not only succession to a certain title or position, such as kingship, but also succession to the wealth amassed by the family, to the eldest firstborn son, is certainly effective in one way, in the sense that it helps to concentrate power, and it helps to you could say,
limit violence by making the system more organized. So you automatically know that you're going to inherit the throne, so you don't need to kill your brother or your father.
Sure. But then the thing is, and this is where another problem comes in, what do you want? What do you want a king to do? Primogeniture can reduce violence, and it's been always seen as sort of the effective, as it were, the civilized way of proceeding. And we see it strongly developing in Europe in the late Middle Ages and early modern age, although not all royal houses and not all noble houses practiced it. We see it to some extent, or we see most of all also developing with some openings in China. There's competitive succession in the Ottoman Empire, in the Safavid Empire, the Mughal Empire. But you have to keep in mind, what's your perspective? If you fix succession, what will you inevitably get? Figures that may be of no specific talent or quality on the throne. So if you need, let's move to, for instance, the Mongol practice, the dynasties that were so very strongly based on mobility and or on martial prowess and military potential, then the sense of having the strongest become king within a certain lineage or become Khan, a leader, it makes sense because you want a person who can somehow outmaneuver the others, either through intelligence or through simple power, but very often through constructing alliances, not only through violence. And this person then will be the most able person to rule your group and and be an effective king. So that can be effective from that perspective. If you are a Chinese bureaucrat and you want continuity before all, and you want a person who adheres to the rules and who adheres to the norms that you yourself are responsible in sort of conveying and educating, then you are very much in favor of ordered succession. And actually, maybe your preference is not to have an emperor who is of the active type, but an emperor who is docile and who simply does what you tell him to do. And so your question has a very clear answer in one respect. Yes, it can reduce violence. Yes, it can create concentration, but it has a far more open and far more difficult answer in the sense of what is really changed by it. And moreover, there's one point I should still mention here. Europe is very often taken sort of as the departing point for comparisons, and then primogeniture would be a good example. And we would say, well, here the situation is in good shape. There's no succession strife. It all works out perfectly well. There's ordered succession, and yeah, violence is reduced. But this is a matter of perspective too, because in Europe, where there was not only a tendency towards primogeniture, and where patrilineal was certainly the dominant form of succession, but where also as the one example in global history, in world history, where there is at least the norm of succession through monogamous marriage. You have primogeniture, you have monogamous marriage, so you have a reduced number of successors, and you have, well, reduced competition, that would be the advantage. You have, to some extent, a reduced gene pool, so there will be more disabled or sickly people on the throne. You have a higher occasion of deaths, and that means that you will find that very frequently that the main line, the senior line of a dynasty becomes extinct. And so what turned out to be bloody rebellions or moments of succession violence in many places in Europe took the format of major international wars between the leading contestants of Europe. So in the 16th and 17th and 18th century, particularly in the 17th and 18th century, we have really mass warfare based on the fact that the Spanish king dies and has no Spanish successor, or that the Austrian emperor dies and leaves a woman who is then seen as unable to succeed. So violence will be there. Violence will be there, but it will take another shape. And I think it is important to not only see where patrilineal and primogeniture fostered concentration of power and fostered succession, but also how they transformed social relations to some extent, and how they transferred violence to other places or to other moments.
All right. So excellent discussion. We really appreciate your thoughts, quite erudite, but unfortunately we have to wrap up. And I must say, I need to get some of your books.
Lipton, I've really enjoyed our conversations, and I think you asked really vital questions. And at any point, I would be very happy to continue our talk.
Yes. All right, Professor. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yes.